Hi, let's do chapter 2. Okie doke. Again, I assume that you've read it by now. If you haven't, please do so. The chapter opens with a case example, and it's talking about the relationship between China and Africa. I'm not going to go through it, but if you haven't thought this already, what's important to get out of this is the fact that yes, in fact, the U.S. may be a powerful country, and it has a powerful role in the economy, the world economy, and certainly we have the largest chunk of it. But we're not the only players. All right, there are, just like you are aware of political alliances and political intervention between countries, there are economic relationships that in some cases are extremely strong, where countries tie their growth to each other, meaning two countries realize that if they work together, there's strong trade between them, and in some cases preferential trade between them. There is a significant increase in the flow of money, and as money moves, people get richer, people get wealthier. It's I'm not sure what you guys think or how you perceive countries like China, because I'm a little older than probably most of you, not that much older, but when I was a kid, Russia was demonized. They were this foreign power that wanted global domination, and we had the Cold War up until I don't know, it was maybe 7, 8 when the Berlin Wall fell. I don't know, but they were kind of the big enemy. China was growing, but not much. They were still a closed country up until 25, 30 years ago, really, when they started opening up. India was, had a lot of people, but there wasn't much happening there. Africa certainly has had its ups and downs and has been extremely volatile in its political systems and its, let's say, human rights characteristics. But, as we start reading through this chapter, I want you to start thinking about the fact that, there are some big countries in the world, and there's a lot of trade. And what we do in the U.S. here is still very profound, but we're just one of many players, all right? And just like any game, you kind of got to be in it to win it. And there's a lot of, I'll say it this way, countries make a decision about what games they're going to be part of. Trade, as we'll talk about, is a really big part of that. Which industries you're going to interact with, which types of resources you're going to seek to acquire and use and convert, which types of products you're going to sell. So there's a big, big question in the economic world about, how does money move, and who is it moving between, and how is it growing, and where is it being stored? And you got to understand that the U.S. is just one of many, many people that are involved in this process, one of many countries. I won't personalize them. China obviously has been growing by leaps and bounds. So has India, so has Brazil, so has Russia. There's a term which I assume will be brought up later called BRIC, and that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China. These are kind of considered the big growing forces. All right, all four of them have gone from very little in terms of sustainable financial assets to large amounts of stable financial assets in a relatively short period of time. They've done this through the conversion of resources and dramatic increases in trade. Now, the descriptions in the textbook here are very good. Read them. I'm not going to explain them in the same way, though. I'm going to explain it from a different perspective, which is what's involved here. The key thing is resources, natural resources, or intellectual resources, or financial resources. What does a country have? How do we build something? How do we create something? How do we have something that we can sell, be it a product or a service? And all of those depend on some form of resource. It could be natural resources. Natural resources in the U.S., we have a lot of lumber, a lot of trees in at least my part of the country. We have a lot of farmland, great, vast areas of land that is excellent for farming, much better than what some other countries have. We have petroleum, we have oil, we have actually a variety of energy resources, a variety of fossil fuel resources, and increasingly we are adding to that nuclear energy, we are adding to that wind-based and solar-based. So, think of it, you could have windmills everywhere, there's some wind, but we have sections of this country that are just flat plains, which are just tremendous for generating wind energy. We have sections of this country that, more desert regions in the south in particular, where solar energy is a very viable option. Even some of the more experimental new things like using waves, ocean waves. Well, we've got a lot of ocean frontage. So we can generate energy. What else do we have? I'm asking a question you can answer in your heads. Yes, we have those things. We have a lot of people, right? We have a large workforce. We have, actually, I don't even know how many people we have in this country now. Are we up to, I don't even want to say because then I'll sound stupid, but I'm looking it up. 321 million. I was going to guess 350. Okay. That's a lot of people. China is at, what's China at? 660 million. No, sorry. China is at 1.4 billion. Canada, which we think is a large trading partner, they're an ally. A Canadian friend described it once as basically an extra 50 miles north of Wisconsin, or north of the U.S., is where most of the people live. But 35 million is not many people. It's a little more than a tenth of the U.S., but yet they have a tremendous amount of resources, and they've generated a tremendous amount of economic activity and wealth. I remember I was teaching at a Christian school in Thailand for a year, many years ago, and most of the teachers there were Canadian. And see, Americans, we don't think about Canada much. They're our cousins, we like them, but, it's not a part of our daily life. But I found that Canadians seem to think about us a lot and compare themselves to us a lot. And one of my favorite classroom experiences was I was in a room with one of the Canadian teachers, and they were talking about how great Canada was. And one of the students was maybe like a fifth grader, raised her hand, and they're like, "Miss Marina, how many people live in Canada?" She's like, 30 million. How many live in the U.S.? 360. And how many live in Thailand? 60. Well, if Canada's so great, how come no one lives there? All right. Now, this made me laugh, of course, but I love Canadians. They're fun people. But here's an interesting point. Here's a country with relatively few people, and they've done quite well for themselves. And they have, largely that's because they have a tremendous amount of resources. Other countries who are of that size often have significantly less, right? I think one of the most fascinating parts of God's creation is that this world does seem to be fairly well balanced with usable, convertible resources. We'll talk about this in a minute about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. But really, there are assets. There are ways to build things and materials you can transform and materials you can sell all over the world. And something you'll find as you do your research and you explore other countries is that some of the countries with the most valuable resources seem to have absolutely nothing in terms of money or, money of the average worker, or quality of life of the average worker, or even kind of general economic output. Countries like Burma, I love Burma, or Myanmar, as it's now called. It's one of my favorite places on earth. The people are amazing. They are very intelligent, very knowledgeable about the world, even though they have limited access to what's going on in the world. And there's just a tremendous amount of natural resources in that country. It's a hotspot for gems, for minerals. In those hills, there's a lot of valuable items. And yet, for many years, they've been in a very depressed economic state. And it's changing now in the last few years. And so you have to ask why. Why is that? Why is this place with so many resources doing so poorly? And the reason is corruption. The reason is, a military-controlled government that takes these resources, works its people to death, denies them a legitimate democratic voice. I mean, they did finally have an election here last year, but even that was suspicious, ironically, on the other side, because Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been the leader of the resistance for many years, was banned from running because she's been a political prisoner and a convict. So someone else ran and said, elect me, and then I'll actually let Aung San Suu Kyi make the decisions. Which, this is a direct violation of our democratic principles, right? But somehow this is how it goes. So, there's confusion and there's conflict and turmoil and, even basic governmental functions. And when you have that type of situation where there's corruption and dramatic barriers that have been placed in front of the average person, and a severe misuse of power, redirection of wealth from where it should be going, or to say that another way, basically abusing one group to fuel another group, you end up with a very stinted and suppressed economy, and a very stinted and suppressed set of rights and opportunities. And basically, if you take the poorest countries and compare them to the richest countries, you're going to find that they have dramatically different views of government, very different views of human rights, very different ratings on scales like power distance, meaning how far is the average person from the person making the decisions? Do they interact at all, or is there one person up here and everyone else is way down? There's a lot of factors here that determine this. But at the fundamental level, what we're talking about is, what does a country have and what can they do with it? Okay? Do they make products? Do they... let me put it this way. You can chop down a tree and saw it up, and it's basically processed, right? You can sell that lumber to make things. You can dig a gold mine, and it's not extremely complex. But when you're done there, you have gold, and that gold you can sell directly. If you're growing food, typically that food is going to require processing, and sometimes a great amount of processing. My family works in transportation, trucking, and I've spent a lot of my younger years working with companies like Del Monte and getting food from the field. And you might think green beans is a very simple thing, but We got to go to the field and we get it and we clean it and we process it and we can it and then we take it to a warehouse and then we bring it back and we label it and then we take it to another warehouse and then we move it here and then if we want frozen vegetables, it's got to go here and then it goes there and then it crosses over here and then we put another label on it. And that food that seems so basic has actually moved a dozen times through 5 different factories and a couple warehouses. And the process of transforming that into a product that you find in your local supermarket is actually very complex. And some countries can manage that and other countries cannot. Things like infrastructure become very important. Do you have good roads? Can you afford trucks, good trucks? Logging, cutting down a tree seems very simple, but what if it's in the rainforest? We obviously have the ethical issues that I mentioned earlier in the last lecture about, what should we be cutting down? But then, it takes a lot to get through the rainforest. So do we have roads? Or are we just going to plow through the whole thing and just take out everything? Are we going to replant? What are we going to do there? And managing this kind of resource-driven economy becomes extremely complex. And as we talk about in later sections here, there are some very dramatically different economic models that try to explain this. And I think there's some truth to probably all of them, and yet none of them seem to work, certainly not on their own. They don't completely explain what's happening here. So I'm going to skip over the historic parts because you can read that and that makes sense. I want to talk about advantage here. Absolute advantage basically says that we can produce something better than our competitor, better than another country. So take a minute and think, what are some things that we in the U.S. are better at doing than anyone else? Are there things? I don't know. We do a lot of things. We have a very diverse country with a lot of resources. I remember talking to a British friend once that, he'd been to, I think, 130 different countries, very well traveled. And he made the comment that, he used to, like many Europeans, they'd make fun of Americans because we never travel. These stupid Americans, they never travel. They live in their little communities and they stay there and whatever. But then he came to the U.S. and he went around and he said, basically, well, I went to your mountains and they're pretty much as good as anything in the Alps, and I went to your beaches and they're pretty much as good as any of the other beaches I've seen, and went through your forests and they're beautiful, so you don't have to travel. And that's a separate anecdote. It's about something else, but I think it's relevant here because we have a very diverse country with very diverse topologies and climates and people and cultures, and we can in fact produce an awful lot. A lot of it is due to our size, both in terms of population and geography, but we've really got an advantage here because there are a few other places in the world that have that level of diversity and that many opportunities available. So there are many industries where we do, I think, have an absolute advantage. Comparative advantage basically just says we can do this better than we can do that. So it's not necessarily that we make, I'm trying to think of an example, but don't read too much into it. We can make, let's say, cars better than we can make motorcycles. This isn't true, but it's an example. So if that's the case, we're going to focus on making cars. Now, we may not be able to make cars as good as the Japanese or as the Germans. If you happen to think that, some of you might, some of you might not. I will say that in the 70s and 80s, Japan kicked our butts in terms of automotive manufacturing. Everything I learned in production management was largely based on understanding what the Japanese had done and what the Germans had done in their production management facilities, because they very quickly had developed a clear advantage over us in terms of quality control and speed to market and production costs and increased overhead. The U.S. after World War II, we were basically the only players in the game left standing, and particularly because we had devoted so much energy towards creating a war production machine. We had these factories, and we had people that were trained. We had women in the workforce that we hadn't had before. So we had all these resources available, so we just started churning out cars and trucks and planes, and no one else had any facilities left to do this except perhaps the British. But they'd had a lot of their stuff bombed, and Germany was leveled and France was leveled. Japan, their production centers were leveled. So we were the only ones going. So we produced all this stuff and we sold it all over the world. And because it was so easy for us at that time, we didn't care too much about optimizing it. We didn't care too much about streamlining and cost cutting. And we have a tremendous amount of space in this country. People, I would pull up my family business on Google Maps to show people in Europe and Asia how much junk we have sitting around. It's all my uncle's junk. It's not mine. But, we have space to do that. We have space to store things. And when you have space to do that, you build up inventory. And as you'll learn in your production management classes, inventory is the enemy. Inventory is a lost cost. And if you can get rid of everything but the essential amount of emergency inventory, you can completely streamline your process. You save a lot of money. You increase the speed. The Japanese figured this out, and they figured all this out while we were just kind of twiddling our thumbs and not focusing on any of it, because we had the market, we had the cars, we had the engines, and our laziness there allowed the Japanese to develop an advantage. And their advantage was not that they had more resources available. Their advantage was that they processed it better, that they could, make a car in hours that would take us days, and the inventory would arrive right when they needed it, and they could transform it and have it out the door in a day. We would buy all this stuff and put it in a warehouse and move it and move it and move it and move it, and then finally put it in the line, and then we'd realize that we had all this stuff that we're not going to use or we can't use because it was machined to do this, and now we needed to do that. It was a mess. So their advantage became production. It wasn't necessarily about what they were producing, but they could produce things better than us. And this hurt our pride, but it also hurt our bottom line, because, think about, how much, even today, it still costs a lot of money to ship. And if someone can produce a car in Japan and float it across the ocean and get it here and sell it for half of what our cars are selling for and make money, they're doing something better than us. All right, so we revamped a lot of our production systems, and we learned a lot from the Japanese, and we learned a lot from the Germans, and from some of these other countries that had, out of necessity, learned how to do things better than us. And that changed our economic landscape quite significantly. So even if you don't have the natural material resources, the raw ingredients, you still have opportunities to kind of make a name for yourself. You have opportunities to make something. It could be product-based. It could also be service-based. As you know, the U.S. economy over the last many years has been moving away from manufacturing and towards service. Service and, I'll say, intellectual digital resources instead of tangible products. And there's many reasons for that. Some because other countries had developed an advantage that we just couldn't beat. Sometimes because we just didn't want to. Sometimes because the changing topography of our workforce made it so that we didn't have the low-cost labor that was necessary. That's what's so interesting about the immigration debates, and I'm not going to go preachy on this or go into it in too much detail, but, I was helping with a family business here a couple months ago, and I was at a factory, and I was talking to one of the forklift drivers there, and in the same statement, he talked about how terrible he thought the Mexicans were coming here and how they were willing to do all this work that he refused to do. This does not reconcile at all. This is not a rational, logical statement. I'm going to look down on someone because they're willing to do something I won't do? What? How does that work? Our country in many ways has been saved these last few years by a population of people willing to work for lower wages. And obviously the legal rights of immigration, and I have every desire to see people here legally established, paying taxes, in the system, transitioning culturally towards the American ideals and all of that. And I support that entirely. But we can't at the same time overlook the fact that this illegal workforce of 10 million, or actually probably in reality much more than that, has been kind of propping up our economic system for a while now. This is a big challenge, and we're not the only country dealing with this. Pretty much every country is facing those types of situations right now and those types of dilemmas. And how do you deal with that? How do you fix that? This has been a very hot topic in this last presidential election, and I haven't seen anyone actually propose solutions, and I don't pretend to have one either. But somehow we've got to reconcile this, because we need people working. You can't have a producing economy without people willing to do the work at a price, at a wage that allows everyone in the system to make money. You can't have a service economy without people willing to work those jobs at a price that is affordable and yet allows everyone to make money. So you can't just throw out your workforce. And too many Americans feel that these jobs are below them now. We have a bizarre situation, and this isn't just us. This isn't anti-American. It's the same situation in Italy and Spain and a lot of Asia right now, where you have a lot of people who are able to work, but they don't, even though there's jobs available. So they go on all day about how there's no jobs, but what it really comes down to is there are jobs. They're just not willing to do those jobs at those prices. So what's the problem here? I remember talking to a Pakistani shop clerk in Barcelona once, because Spain right now and Italy have just unheard of unemployment. And, the local people are very racially aggressive towards many of the immigrants there in Europe, because you have North Africans, South Africans, Middle Easterners, Eastern Europeans. There's a lot of immigrants in Europe, and the locals are all very opposed to them. Not all, but most of them. And so I was talking to him about it, and I'm like, I just asked him, how are you doing? Because it was during a time when there was a big debate going on about immigration, and Catalonia was trying to separate from Spain, and I'm like, how are you holding up? And he's like, well, everyone comes in here and they yell at me, and they hate me, and everyone I ever talk about, or everything I read in the news is people talking about how they can't find jobs and how we're stealing their jobs. And he's like, listen, I'm here. I've got 3 brothers here. We're all working. We work hard. We work 16 hours a day, and we support our families. And they can do it if they want to, but they don't want to, so I'm going to do it. And I'm going to build myself up. And that's the right attitude. So these issues of absolute and comparative advantage, we often like to think of them in very kind of segmented terms of resources and labor and capital. But it's more than that. It's attitude. Also, it's opportunities. It's how bad do people want it? How much do people understand the importance of this? Most of you are millennials, and I don't know if I should avoid politics altogether, but it's relevant here. And people like Bernie Sanders got a lot of traction, appealing to a very millennial populist perspective of, the government should pay for everything. You should get free education, and then you should get the exact job you want, and you should get the salary you want, and you should have housing available at a price you want. And that's all great, of course. We'd all love that. But, the government can't spend money it doesn't have. And what happens to your economy if it's based on the fact that I should have everything I want and only do the type of work I want when I want to and get the amount of money I want for it? That doesn't work. That's not real world. That's irrelevant to the realities of the market for the most part. I'll come back to why that is actually a somewhat valid perspective, or some of those perspectives are important. But this advantage, it's much more than just a base resource. And you can read these models, and I want you to learn these models. I want you to learn the difference between them. I think they're self-explanatory, so I don't need to explain them one by one. But what you've got to understand is that none of these is complete. None of these are comprehensive, and you can't rely on any one of these to govern your views. I love economics in the sense that I think it's important. I think it's a really fun topic to think about. But I have a huge beef with anyone that overestimates the ability of an economic model to predict the future and to govern decision making, because you have to understand that every economic model is a behavioral model. It's based on an understanding of who humans are and how they act, how they will spend their money, how they will make their decisions. And if those foundational behavioral models are not correct, then your overarching economic model is not going to be correct. And you can see from this list that a lot of people have tried to build models, and none of them work entirely. They work in part. They explain certain things. And I've seen this in the Christian community too. I won't say the university. I was at another Christian university, and they were having a conference on Christianity and economics and whatever. And a guy who's a researcher I really respect, and he had written a couple books on this, and he got up and he picked one economic model and spent 2 days talking about how Christians need to adhere to this model. And, things like free trade coffee is bad, and we shouldn't support those types of things. And, I tried to speak up, and I just got shut down every time, whatever. But, you can't take a secular economic model and say that it's the Christian perspective, because the Christian perspective is a Christian understanding or a biblical understanding of how do Christians behave and how do non-Christians behave. If you start there and then build your models up, you're going to have something. But, I love these models. You need to understand them, and in any decision you're making, you need to think through these and figure out which one satisfies the most requirements, or which one conforms to the structures you have, and you can use that as a guide. But I don't want you to adhere to, I don't want you to pick one of these models and say, this is it. This is the one we use. Now, maybe your economics professor says differently, and I respect them, whoever they are, and you are free to make your own decisions here. But my own personal opinion is, be careful with this type of behavioral model, because it can lead you down a path that's not going to result in the way that you predicted. Should I say more about that, or did I make my point? Maybe I just destroyed someone's belief in economics. I didn't intend that. Just be better than what's out there. And I say that having zero desire myself to get involved. Okay, next. Oh, this is taking too long. I wanted to be quick about these. Political and legal factors. There's a lot of these. Your textbook kind of covers what the main factors are, but it doesn't really tell you anything about them. I think this would be a great opportunity for you to do some research on your own if you want to. Certainly you're going to deal with these when you do the country report, which I'll be explaining soon, next week. But what you got to understand is, governments come in many different shapes and forms. You can pick pretty much any of these criteria, and if you try to apply it to a particular country, it's going to fall apart. Even the U.S. legal system, which, we like to say we're a free trade system. We like to say that we have a judicial system based on civil law, which is, our judges interpret the law and our judges apply the law to a case. But in reality, increasingly, it's a common law system, which is, judges kind of interpret things. Our Supreme Court has made several rulings lately that do not conform to the civil law. They are a reinterpretation to support a social concept, a cultural ideal. It's not that far of a leap then to get to religious law or irreligious law. An atheistic perspective of culture can lead to just as many, or can have just as much influence on a law as any particular religious system, right? I think we're seeing that more here. And you see this in every culture. Every country around the world has some contradictions in its legal system, some divergence from what they claim to have or what they used to have and what they actually have today. And you need to really pay attention to that. It's just as easy to get into trouble because you didn't understand the law as it is to get into trouble because you thought you understood how the law worked, but in reality, it's somehow different. Back to Burma, I met with the pastor at it was a church started by Hudson Taylor, you know him, up in Mandalay, and great church. I happened to be there on Christmas Eve, and they were thrilled I was there because they had learned a couple songs in English, but there was no one there that spoke, no foreigners there, so they moved me up and they all sang these songs to me. It was nice. But I spent some time talking with the pastor, and they had the church had the rights to this. These were started by missions agencies, and they had pulled out about 40 years before, and now there were some groups, they were secular groups, but they were tied to the military government that were trying to claim the rights to all the church properties in Mandalay and Yangon and Inle Lake and some of the other places, because these churches had been there for in some cases 100 years, 150 years, and they were prime real estate. And the law, according to the law, this church had the rights, they had the documentation. But what it came down to is the other companies were paying off the judges. And so one by one, the churches were losing their properties simply because they didn't have enough money to pay the judges. And back to the ethics discussion, in that conversation, it didn't seem to me that the pastor was suggesting because we wouldn't bribe, it was just because we don't have the money to do that. And so, you have these legal systems that are supposed to function in a certain way, but when you have things like corruption that come in, or you have dramatically shifting social and cultural climate, quite often what you expect to happen, or what you feel would be right to happen, doesn't happen. And a lot of companies have gotten into big trouble or faced very severe conflicts because they expected the legal system to function in a way that it ended up doing. And so that largely happens because you can split up legal systems however you want. You can, um, or even the economic systems. Fair trade. We in the U.S. we believe in free trade. That's one of our stated foundations of our economic system, but it's not real, right? Is there free trade? We have import duties. We have an entire, we have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations and ordinances and restrictions on what you can make, what you can buy, what you can sell, how you sell it, how you transport it. So, at a certain point, is it free trade anymore? How do you balance that? And the reality is every place is unique. And it's unique not just in its history or in its stated goals, but it's actually unique to here's how it's actually done today. Here's what the government actually looks like. Here's how our trade actually works. So I want you to read through these. I want you to understand the differences because this is how you start to evaluate countries. But as you do your research in a place, you've got to do actual research and talk to people on the streets and say, how do things actually work here? What are the regulations? Sometimes there are countries where, Thailand, for example, is relatively free trade. They love foreign businesses. They treat them pretty well for the most part. They welcome them in. But you have to understand that monopolies reign in Thailand, and it's legal to have monopolies. So even though the economic system is very similar to the U.S. in some regards, in many regards, in fact, in the U.S. we break up monopolies. Over there they do not. So that means that you can make T-shirts, let's say silk shirts, because that is a very strong monopoly. It's controlled by some members of the royal family and some members of a political family that is very well controlled. You can do that, but they're not going to let you. They're going to wield all of their power to keep you out of their market, and that could include some criminal means as well, because that happens. So you got to dig in all of these situations. And so I think, the textbook explains this stuff well, so I want you to read those and I want you to understand those. But the point is that these are starting points, and every country is going to be a little bit different. How does the government intervene? These are very important. You've got to know these tariffs. These are taxes. These are basically trade taxes. Sometimes these are fixed. Sometimes these are work in a ratio. I'm honestly not too sure what some of our current U.S. tariffs are. I could look that up. I should look that up. I'm thinking of other countries. I'll stick with Thailand because we were just there. A luxury car in Thailand is going to have about a 300% markup. Pretty much any luxury item is. But it's very important for the people there to show their wealth. So they sell a lot. I was there first in about 2003, and that was a few years after they'd had a significant economic collapse, largely driven by George Soros, which is why if he ever steps foot in the country, he's going straight to prison. But there was a place downtown Bangkok where you could go, and it was a parking garage, and it was full, maybe 6 or 7 floors of Mercedes, because the Thais love their Mercedes, and even though they're paying, in reality, like well over 100,000, 150, 200,000 to get a Mercedes in the country because of their tariffs, they have to have them. But then the economic collapse hit, and so Mercedes repossessed them all, but then couldn't move them because of the tariffs and certain other issues related to it. So they've all been sitting there for years. I don't know if they're still there, but it was kind of like a Mercedes museum. That's kind of cool, actually. Subsidies. A subsidy is when the government supports certain types of transactions, and they do this through direct assistance. It could include a loan. It could include a tax break. Sometimes it's cash. Sometimes it's just lowering the taxes that you pay on that. I keep fighting the urge to ask questions and have you answer, but you can't do that here. So, some of the things that a government could subsidize, sometimes it's short term. If, for example, there's, let's say, a petroleum processor. Well, let's put it this way. Let's say that, when the, what do you call it? The oil platform, oil well, it's not called a well, there's a name for it. Whatever, in the Gulf of Mexico, a couple years ago here, blew up. All oil companies working in the Gulf were forced to stop operation. While they were forced to stop operation, there's actually some subsidization of foreign producers. So foreign companies were sending as much oil as they could into the Gulf ports, while the companies that were here were not allowed to function. Now, I think this was stupid, but this is an example of what happens, because there's a need, sometimes short term, for an increase in product. So the government makes it possible, makes it easier. Trump is talking about doing, playing a lot with tariffs and subsidies here to restructure our trade environment. If you don't want a company to leave the U.S., you don't want them to move their factory somewhere else. If the government wants to stop that, one of the few ways that they can do that is to give them subsidies. The other way is to threaten them with tariffs if they're going to bring it back, or import quotas, or voluntary restraints. You do this to try to control what's coming and going. In a strictly free trade scenario, you don't have these necessarily. But I think these are very important, and they should be used carefully and judiciously, but they are necessary in some cases. If you have, let's pick Apple. They have their phones produced in China, and there's some talk about them establishing production here in the U.S., but I don't think anything's been finalized yet. Over the last couple of years, they've taken a lot of flack because it was found that in some of the factories making their products, there's child labor and strong, excessive hours and abusive employee treatment. And they supposedly took steps to fix all this, whatever. They blamed it on the subcontractors, whatever. But, a lot of people who take issue with this, particularly those who are concerned about child labor and concerned about these things, which I think all of us should be, obviously. But, that's an extreme example, but, there's lower level labor ethical issues that we should still be concerned about. But why should we let Apple bring products in at a very low cost if the reason that they're doing that is because they're somehow exploiting workers? And I'm not picking on Apple, though I kind of do hate them. I'll pick on them a lot. But, if that's the case, then we need some kind of restriction there, right? Products coming from India or Pakistan, textiles, a lot of them are coming from sweatshops where people are locked in, hundreds of people in unsafe factories. And, a lot of these construction-wise, they were built as maybe one story or two story, and then they expanded, so they added another story, and then they added another story and added another story. And, these buildings were not designed for that. And so there's a lot of collapses and fires that break out, and people are locked in, and, just terrible, terrible things. So should we allow products to be coming in so cheaply from these places when we know that there's a very good chance that there are some basic abuses of human rights occurring. How do you deal with that? So do you add some quotas? Do you try to add tariffs to the extent that the price is high enough that companies from other countries or our own country can compete, knowing that they are treating their workers better or being more responsible about the natural resources? These interact quite a bit, and most of the times that a country has to enact these, there is a specific strategy involved. They want to increase exports of something we produce, or they want to limit something that's coming in that is somehow threatening our national advantage. And I'm okay with that in many situations. Some I'm not. But I think these are all legitimate factors that we have to consider. Anti-dumping, I explained that in the other lesson. Free trade zones. These are places where countries can set up, think of it as like a big business park. Some of these are huge, where if you build and make your product there and ship it out, you are allowed certain benefits. It could be reduced taxes or streamlined customs, fewer restrictions. The purpose of this is to support trade. Products that are manufactured in free trade zones are not allowed to be sold locally. There's a lot of these in the Caribbean. Dominican Republic, I know, has quite a few, and I believe Mexico, maybe everyone does. I'm just more familiar with some of the ones in the Caribbean. Products that are made there are not legally allowed to be sold. They have to be exported. So the governmental philosophy is we want more cash coming in, so we're going to create this area, and these companies have to sell overseas, because if they're selling overseas, we're bringing more money in. If they sell it locally, we're not bringing more money in. Okay, so they give them tax breaks and they make it easy to do, but then they have to sell it. They have to export it. Okay, then you have administrative and bureaucratic, and I am sure I will talk about bureaucracies and my despise for them later. Oh, I hate it. I have horror stories. All right, direct foreign investment or foreign direct investment, FDI. Indirect investment is when you, we used to call it indirect. They call it portfolio investment. If you buy stocks in another country, if you buy stocks in a company in another country, you are investing overseas. But unless you're buying a lot of preferred stock, you don't have any control over that company. Maybe you can work with a proxy and get some kind of influence on the board, but it's highly unlikely. You are at the mercy of this company. You're doing it just because you think they're going to grow, and this is a way for you to increase your assets. Direct foreign investment, foreign direct investment, I'm sure we used to call it the other way around. This is when you're actually buying assets. All right, you're buying a company, buying land, creating a factory. When you do this type of investment, this is long term for the most part. It's a significant expense. The risks increase because I mentioned earlier, in some countries you can own land, some you can't. Sometimes you can lease. Sometimes you're required to have local partners. And local partners can be a tremendous asset if they know what they're doing and they have good connections and influence in the market. They can also be a tremendous anchor around your neck if basically they just want to extort you and take all the profit. And that happens too. So FDI, for most companies, they reach a point where they have to be involved in this. If they want access to the global market, they have to reach the point where they are involved in some form of FDI. To do that, you have to be very clear that this is what you want to do. There's a number of factors here that they list: cost, logistics, market, natural resources, know-how, whatever. That's a good list. You should learn that. Those are all very, very important. so many companies think that this will be an easy process. They go to a seminar, they hear a government pitch, inviting foreign investments, and all the things that they're going to provide, and then they get on the ground and nothing works the way it was supposed to. Typically, projects like this end up costing easily 2 or 3 times as much as was budgeted, because there's so much more complexity than people might imagine. The advantages or some of the ways that this can be done easier is to operate in certain, like the free trade zones. Sometimes companies will establish parks for this, for companies that want to do business here, and they'll create an infrastructure that will allow them to do that easily. But if you're just picking a random location and saying, I want to build a factory over there, I should point on the screen, you might run into some hassles that you absolutely did not foresee, and it could tank the whole project. So again, you got to do your homework here. Pay close attention to all these factors. When you do your project, the big project, the final project, come back and look at this list right away and do your research on how can you mitigate those risks and how can you satisfy the requirements of that place. When governments get involved here, it's, again, the biggest issue or the biggest factor that the government has, or force that the government has, is going to be through taxes, controlling the financial aspects, and ownership, which I already discussed. If you can find a good partner, that's the best thing in the world. In my experience, finding good partners is also one of the hardest things in the world. Blah, blah, blah. We're getting along. I'm going to wrap up. I think that about covers what we need. So the key takeaways here are, again, you got to do your research. Look at the economic system and look at the political system first. Is this a place that wants you? Do they want your business? Do they want your product? Are they structured in a way that will allow you to enter that market and engage in it meaningfully in the easiest, smoothest way possible? If your answers to those are no, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do business there, because sometimes the opportunities are tremendous and for everyone involved. But you're going to have to work harder. You're going to have to break through a lot of walls legally, but break through a lot of barriers that can seriously conflict with your interests and hinder what you want to do. Okay? Any questions, let me know. See ya in Chapter 3. Stop.